Thanks everyone for joining us for kickoff weekend of Polar DinoFest, a 10-week exploration into the world of polar dinosaurs. My name is Randy Ermis. I'm the Chief Curator and Curator of Paleontology here at the Natural History Museum of Utah, where I'm live from the paleontology collections. We're wrapping up our kickoff weekend live streams with our final speaker, keynote speaker, in fact, Dr. Peter Makavicky. These live conversations are just the beginning of 10 weeks of polar dinosaur exploration online, during which we'll release a new video from one of our paleontologists each Friday at 10 a.m. Mountain Time between now and April 2nd. You can see this weekend's recorded conversations and see each speaker's Polar DinoFest video as they're posted on our website at nhmu.utah.edu/DinoFest. If you want to participate in this final conversation, we encourage you to submit your questions now via that webpage or in the chat on Facebook or on YouTube. So without further ado, let's meet our guest and keynote speaker, Dr. Peter Makavicky, who is professor in the Department of Earth and Environmental Sciences at the University of Minnesota. Thanks for joining us this evening, Pete.
Thank you, Randy. Pleasure to be here.
So before we get started with all the questions, and we're really excited to have you here, could you tell us a little bit about your specialty within paleontology?
Yes, so I am a dinosaur paleontologist. Principally, I work on understanding the evolution of dinosaurs throughout the Mesozoic and even into the Cenozoic when they are called birds. And so I have a couple of groups I focus on. One are the theropods or meat-eating dinosaurs, which of course include the precursors to birds. And then I like to work on various groups of ornithischians or bird-hipped dinosaurs, including Ceratopsians, and more recently on various ornithopod dinosaurs.
Cool. And how did you get involved in doing research on polar dinosaurs?
In my previous job, I was actually the curator of dinosaurs at the Field Museum in Chicago. And we were lucky enough to be the repository. So our collection, the Field Museum version of what people can see behind you on the screen there, was actually the place where Cryolophosaurus and Glacialosaurus, at the time, only two known Antarctic dinosaurs from the central transantarctic mountains were deposited. And so I got to know not just Bill Hammer, the guy who led those expeditions, but his former student, Nate Smith, joined my lab as a graduate student. And so we then collaborated on the 2010-11 expedition to the Beardmore Glacier region, which is where Cryolophosaurus comes from. And then, at that point I was sort of hooked and tied into that community. And so we went back in 2017-18 in a different part of the transantarctic mountains in a section called the Cumulus Hills, which is mainly lower Triassic exposures.
Very cool. And so my understanding is, it takes a lot of effort to get to Antarctica and do field work there. Is that something where you get to go every year, or how often do you do field work there?
Well, I've only been twice. Once in 2010-11. Remember, we go during the austral summer, which is usually over Christmas and New Year. And then again in the austral summer of 17-18. So the places that we look for fossils are fairly remote. And so there has to be a pretty big investment of infrastructure in that part of the central transantarctic mountains. The NSF, the National Science Foundation, has to actually put in a big camp that we can base out of. And that doesn't, of course, happen yearly. So that's why there's such a long lag between our expeditions. There are other places in Antarctica that are more accessible and therefore people can go more frequently, especially anyone working closer to one of the permanent bases like McMurdo or Palmer can go yearly or at least more frequently than we've been able to go. But we need those places where we work are hundreds of miles from any sort of permanent base, and so we need, you know, all this infrastructure for the work to actually happen.
So following up on that, one of our viewers, Colin, on YouTube was wondering, do you have any idea when your next expedition will be?
We don't. That's so the run up to these expeditions is quite a long procedure. These bigger sort of camps that I talked about, there's resources to put in one every year or every couple of years, maybe two some years. But they have to cover the full gamut of Antarctic sciences. So for example, a few years ago, all that infrastructure was put in on the Pine Island Glacier on the East Antarctic ice sheet to study glaciology, ice movements, and various things related there. So that iteration of the camp didn't have any paleontology in it. So what happens in the prelude is that we have these organizing meetings of Antarctic Earth scientists or scientists who want to work in the interior on a variety of topics. And then we try to find consensus, build consensus around certain parts of Antarctica where different groups have research questions and where it would make sense to put in a camp. And then we write up reports and send them to NSF and do some lobbying with NSF, and then they sort of figure out how to apportion those camps accordingly. So it's actually a multi-year procedure from those initial meetings up to when the camps get announced, proposals go in, get reviewed, et cetera, et cetera. So, so I have no prediction on when the next one's going in.
Well, for those of you who have been lucky enough to see the Antarctic Dinosaurs exhibit, either here at the Natural History Museum of Utah, where it's ongoing until April 4th, or at other museums, you'll get a chance to see Pete's work featured in there. And there's also quite a bit about what it's like to do field work in Antarctica and what it takes to get there. So if you haven't seen it and you have a chance to check it out here at the Natural History Museum, I encourage everyone to do so. I think you alluded to this a little bit, but once you're there in Antarctica, Dusty on Facebook was wondering how long the dig season actually lasts.
Yeah, so the last season, they're on average about 6 to 8 weeks. And so these camps go in with a different number of teams. And some people are, you know, in remote fields. Some people do fairly short trips. They only need a couple, 3 weeks there. For us, as paleontologists, it's fairly slow work. You have to cover a lot of ground to find fossils, and then it actually takes a considerable amount of time to dig them up. So we try to go for as long as those camps are in place and will support our work. So that tends to be 6 to 8 weeks in order to make sure that we can actually find something and have time to dig it up.
But that's dependent on the weather, I assume, right? You don't always get perfectly sunny days. Right?
Yeah. So one of the sort of limiting factors is helicopter time. All our field work is helicopter supported. And so all the science teams have to, I don't know, are you able to share your screen? I have a few photos I can throw up if people want.
Yeah, one of my colleagues controlling the Zoom might be able to allow you to do that.
So basically we have a number of aircraft in these camps, usually 2 helicopters, and then a Twin Otter fixed wing plane. And so depending on where people have to go, and almost everyone needs air support at some point, often daily, we have to share those, and so you get assigned a certain amount of time, but if you are actually, if the weather turns out to be bad where you want to go, then you end up missing your turn, so to speak. So it can really depend. So in 2010-11, we were working on Mount Kirkpatrick. So pretty high altitude, 12,500 feet. Kirkpatrick is actually the tallest mountain in the middle part of the central, in the central Transantarctics. And so we would often, that mountain would often have a little bit of cloud on it, even though all the surrounding peaks were nice and clear. And the pilots would just say, you know, we can't land in that, and you'd miss a day.
Yeah.
When we worked in the Shackleton Glacier region in the most recent season, we had perfect weather. I think we lost one day to.
Oh, wow. Well, it looks like you can share your screen. So if you do want to show some of those photos, go for it.
So let me see. Here we can see. Oh, I need to hit the share button. Yeah, so you can see here the two helicopters that we would rely on. And so you'd have something like perhaps 7 or 8 teams relying on these resources on any one given day. Wow. And so if the weather was not good at your site, they would be simply reassigned. And so you might lose a day that way.
Cool. Well, you just talked about what conditions were like doing field work, you know, in modern day Antarctica. And we have a number of questions about what it was like back during the age of dinosaurs. And this is something that the exhibit touches on quite a bit. So people were wondering, you know, was it cold or snowy during the time of Cryolophosaurus?
Well, we know it was certainly warmer. Just the fact that we have fossils of plants and animals there tell us that the climate was much more equitable. We don't have any coal layers from the rock units that produced Cryolophosaurus, but we have coals pretty close to it underneath in the late Triassic. And the presence of coals basically tell us that you have a humid and quite warm environment. Coals, as a geological formation, tend to only form in sort of subtropical or warm temperate types of habitats. So those are pretty good indications that things were much warmer back then. We don't have any evidence of glaciation. There has been some modeling work combined with carbon isotopes data suggesting that somewhere in the early to mid-Jurassic, you may have had a very short period of glaciation or sort of glaciers growing at polar regions. But we don't see that in the actual rock record there. Part of the reason being, of course, you have the top of the rock sequence in Antarctica is made up of volcanic rocks, which, of course, I'm not going to show very much in the way of drop stones or other features that are indicators of glaciation.
Right. Cool. I think a group of dinosaurs you had mentioned a little bit ago that came up also was one of the questions is one of the types of dinosaurs you find there is a group called Soropodomorphs. Could you first just describe what those dinosaurs are?
Yeah, so Soropodomorphs are sort of the bigger, more inclusive group that includes the long-necked quadrupedal dinosaurs that you're all familiar with from not just Jurassic Park, but the Flintstones, Dino from the Flintstones. So long necks and robust limbs, things like Brachiosaurus, Brontosaurus, that we all grew up knowing. But besides those animals, which are predominantly known from the late Jurassic and Cretaceous rocks throughout the world, and especially well represented in Utah, where you are, you also have a number of smaller, earlier, sort of more ancestral looking things that are, you know, between 1 ton and a few tens of kilograms in size. And many of these animals were not quadrupedal yet. They were small, and they sort of, we can tell from their hand structure that they were actually still walking on 2 hind legs. although they have some of the hallmarks of all Soropodomorphs, which is that very long neck and relatively small head with leaf-like teeth for eating vegetation.
Cool. And in the Antarctic dinosaur exhibit, there's actually several different species of Soropodomorphs on display, two of which don't have an official scientific name yet. And so one of our viewers on YouTube wanted to know whether you will get to name those new species.
Yeah, we are working on it. It's taken a long time to get there for various reasons, partly because there's a lot of activity in that field. And so as we move our manuscript along, we keep having to edit it and revise it. And partly because, you know, the people working on it, myself included, Nate Smith, who was on, I think, yesterday, one of your events, and so forth. We're just in different places and at different times, so trying to coordinate. But yeah, I actually have a 3D print of that very animal right here.
Oh, awesome. Maybe could you stop screen share so we can see it larger?
Yeah, I will do that.
Because that's a really cool 3D print. I want people to see it.
So I found my Zoom. Please bear with me. There we go. Yeah, so I'm going to hold it up here, and you can see sort of the tooth rows along here. I'll actually use a toothpick, how appropriate. And then you've got the nostril, and then back up here, you would have parts of the brain case. And on the other side, you can see the lower rim of the orbit or the eye socket. So we don't have the skull roof on this particular skull, but we have some of the skull roofing bones apparently came off. You know, this was one of those finds that came late in the field season in 2010-11. And the fossil was sort of discovered in a near vertical wall of rock. So we had just 2 days. We actually traded with someone for helicopter time. We'd used up our allotted time to be able to extract this. And so we sort of just had to kind of chunk out vertical pieces of rock from this rock wall. And we had no idea that this skull was in there. We just saw little cross sections of bone. And then turns out we had 2 partial skeletons side by side, but that overlapped in many ways, but also had complementary regions. So we have a nearly complete understanding of this animal. The only part we're actually missing are the feet below the ankles. So you can see the little model in the exhibit, and then a fleshed out version as well.
Yeah, and if you come and see the exhibit in person, you can see some of those original fossils on display, including the original skull, which is just really gorgeous. Beautiful specimen. So going from these early Soropodomorphs to later in time, during the Cretaceous period, Colin on YouTube was wondering if there's any evidence of Titanosaurs from Antarctica.
Yeah, that's a great question. There is. So far, I've mostly, you and I have been mostly talking about the central transantarctic mountains. And so this is sort of towards the middle of the continent. It's the mountain range that splits the east and west Antarctic ice sheets. And the rock sequence there starts in the Permian and then ends in the middle Jurassic. And then we actually have a gap in the geological history of Antarctica that we then pick up somewhere in the middle of the Cretaceous, or towards the latter half of the Cretaceous, the younger half of the Cretaceous, the Antarctic Peninsula. So the end of Antarctica that sticks up towards South America and the Drake Passage. And those sediments have produced dinosaur remains, including a titanosaur tail vertebra. It's not much to go on, but thankfully titanosaurs have very characteristic vertebrae. They have a ball and socket joint where the ball actually points backward and the socket towards the front end. And no other sauropods do that. Really, well, there are no dinosaurs that do it in the tail vertebrae. So very characteristic. So we can definitively say that Titanosaurs were present. And that makes a lot of sense because the peninsula would actually at the time have connected by, there was a land connection through the peninsula to South America, which of course had quite a rich fauna of titanosaurs.
Cool. And getting back to what you were talking about earlier, you mentioned that the Soropodomorph was found in 2010, and we're still doing the work, scientific work on it. So I think that really shows how much effort goes into the scientific process beyond just the field work. But there's lots of really good questions following up on field work. I think people are really intrigued to hear what it's like in Antarctica. Dizzy was wondering how whether your field work has been affected by the delays that are over the past year or not. Has that affected the timing for Antarctica at all?
Well, it hasn't affected my field work personally, but it has affected other people working in Antarctica. Actually, my wife was supposed to head down in January. My wife is an ornithologist, so she works on penguins. She was part of a recent publication on a new species of gentoo penguin. And so she and her collaborators were supposed to, they had basically contracted a research vessel and were going to go to the subantarctic islands. But they, along with all other science teams, have largely been basically frozen in the sense nobody was allowed to go there because of COVID. So there are a lot of projects that are delayed all around the world.
And Dusty was wondering, since you have a limited time when you go down there and maybe you find something on the last day, what if anything do you do to preserve it if you have to come back a few years later?
Well, the short answer is you don't do anything. And here's why. So normally, if you and I were to go and find something in Utah, and we want to dig it up next year, we would often put a plaster cap on it, and maybe tarp it to keep moisture from getting in and damaging it with freeze thawing, and then cover it with sediment. In fact, I did that just last summer in Utah. In Antarctica, first of all, plaster, we do use it at some of the lower elevations. It made no sense to use it at the Cryolophosaurus quarry at 12,500 feet. You would not be able to keep water liquid for long enough to actually mix a batch of plaster. So the silver lining to it is that the rocks in Antarctica are actually very hard. So these volcanics that I talked about in the Middle Jurassic, these are essentially a result of the rifting, the initiation of rifting of the continent. So when Pangaea and the southern part, known as Gondwana, started splitting apart, you'd have these massive intrusions of lava. And these have actually baked the rocks. So they're pretty hard. And they don't weather very fast. To give you an idea, when we went back in 2018 to some of the sites that had been collected in the first vertebrate paleontology expedition to the Transantarctics in 1970, we could find their excavation pits with little bits of plaster around them. So, I mean, and it was still sticking to the rock. It hadn't weathered at all. So weathering's not a problem, the same way it would be in other parts of the world. So you don't really have to do anything.
Cool. Well, that's good. That's good news to hear, especially since you can't get down there every year. And I think you mentioned how part of the process of getting down there is applying to National Science Foundation for grant funding. Is that basically the only way you fund it, or are you able to get other funding to support your work, or is it all NSF?
I think most of us basically have done it through different government grants. obviously the Argentinian and British surveys work through their government funding agencies. But yeah, the sort of logistics and the infrastructure required are so complicated and so big that it's quite hard to think of a private way of doing it, at least to the parts of the continent we've been at.
Gotcha.
Um,
And you had mentioned earlier Cryolophosaurus, and of course it's quite a charismatic animal. So we have a number of questions about the unusual looking meat eater. And in particular, Stephanie on YouTube was wondering how Cryolophosaurus caught its prey.
How it caught its prey? That's a good question. We imagine it probably used some combination of its jaws and its forelimbs. The forelimbs are one of the poorest, one of the regions of the body we have the poorest knowledge of. We have fragments of the humerus and the forearm bones. But based on where we think it fits phylogenetically, who it's related to, the forelimbs of Dilophosaurus, I think, would be a good model for what we could expect Cryolophosaurus to have. So it's some combination of those parts of the animal that would be the prey acquisition or business end of it. We don't know if there was any particular prey preference. What we do know is that we find a number of shed teeth. We found probably a dozen up to this point, shed teeth in the main quarry, which had bones of Cryolophosaurus and the Soropodomorph glacialosaurus in it. And we presume that some of this represents scavenging on either or both of those skeletons. So we do know that quite possibly there was some cannibalism going on. Because we think those teeth, we're fairly certain they belong to Cryolophosaurus, based on features of their, how many, the serrations, the little steak knife edges on them, the statistics on those, but also we did some microscopy work on the structure of the dentine and the enamel, and basically the teeth of the known skull of Cryolophosaurus seem to match up with these shed teeth.
Although you mentioned already it was quite a bit warmer during this time, there were still times of the year when it was quite dark. So Ian in Tremonton, Utah was wondering whether Cryolophosaurus shows any adaptations or specializations to living in that environment.
Yeah, that's a good question. So one of the interesting things, of course, is that even if it's not cold, you're not going to have photosynthesis happening in a place like Antarctica if you have polar darkness. And so we think that the plants, aren't really the fodder that would be the plant fodder that would be sort of the building foundation for the rest of the ecosystem is sort of shut down for several months of the year. And if that had any effect on the animals, the one way we sort of looked at it indirectly is to see if these animals grew in a different way, that maybe there was something in the growth of either the Soropodomorphs or of Cryolophosaurus that reflected sort of a harsh period of the year where maybe growth was slowed down. By and large, we didn't see any evidence of that. The patterns of growth that we're looking for by taking cross-sections of bone and sort of the pores and canals and lines of arrested growth and other features in the bone in Cryolophosaurus are pretty comparable to dinosaurs from temperate regions. So there's, for example, nothing, at least qualitatively, that looks very different between the sections of Cryolophosaurus we have to those of Allosaurus that you have in the museum in Utah. And the same goes for the Soropodomorphs. So the little Soropodomorph, this cute little guy, we know is small because it's a juvenile. It's very rapidly growing, and it seems to be growing faster than animals that are living at the same time but at lower latitudes, like Massospondylus or
Well, that's
Mosasaurus. So in that sense, there seems to be nothing limiting the way these can grow. That's as much as we can say, I think.
that's a perfect segue into a question that Amy on YouTube had, was whether there's evidence that these dinosaurs were endothermic versus ectothermic.
So that's a tough question. I think we maybe have played our hand a little bit by putting dino floof, proto feathers on our Cryolophosaurus model in the exhibit. Their growth rates are certainly high, and in a very broad sense, high growth rates tend to be observed more frequently in homeothermic animals that we call warm-blooded, rather than poikilotherms, animals that are sort of classically known as cold-blooded. But it's not a complete sort of one-to-one correspondence. There are warm-blooded animals that grow quite slowly, including our own species. In fact, we do not grow as big in 18 years as an American alligator, a clearly cold-blooded animal, does. So it's not a surefire way of saying that, but in a general sense, we can see that growth patterns in these dinosaurs are comparable to growth rates in some homeothermic animals today.
Amy was also wondering if there are any clearly ectothermic animals in these ecosystems.
Yeah, so we don't have anything that we can definitively say is an ectotherm in the lower Jurassic Hansen Formation fauna. This is the dinosaur fauna with Cryolophosaurus, Glacialosaurus, the other two Soropodomorphs. And the other things we found there are a wing bone of a pterosaur, which we think most likely were endotherm or homeothermic animals, because flight is an extremely energy demanding activity. And then the other thing we have is a tooth of a tritylodont, which is a therapsid mammal-like animal. So something that's very close to being an actual mammal, and therefore presumably also homeothermic. But if we step back in time to the early Triassic, the sites we worked in 2017-18, there are animals that at least phylogenetically, that is, if you look at what they're related to that's alive today, things like procolophonids, little sort of parareptiles that most likely would have been poikilotherms, that is, cold-blooded animals. So we have a number of species there.
So you've mentioned, in talking about the early Jurassic, you've mentioned a couple of different types of dinosaurs and other animals found there in the Hansen Formation. Do we have enough of a sample to say which are most common, carnivores versus herbivores, for example?
Well, we have in a rather small area, probably about the extent of a football field, and in a few overlying, sort of sequentially overlying series of sediments or episodes of sedimentation, we have remains of 6 animals. 4 of them are Soropodomorphs. So we have Glacialosaurus, which is the big guy. We have another partial skeleton from nearby that could be Glacialosaurus, certainly is big enough to be, but we only have a few bits, some rib pieces, and the biggest other thing is a piece of hip bone and some sections of limb bone, so not much to go on. And then we have these 2 juveniles, one of which we've talked about extensively, that are smaller. Not much to go on, but enough to tell they're different species. So we have 4 plant eaters, and then we have parts of 2 Cryolophosaurus from the quarry. We actually originally thought there was only one, and over the years of collecting and preparation, we suddenly found some overlapping parts. So we realized we had two brain cases. And you can actually see both in the exhibit. We have the skull with the crest, that's the holotype, and then the second one that appeared over time in three different blocks of rock that we sort of put together. And so most of the overlap we have there is that brain case and then in vertebrae. So it's taken some detective work to sort them out. But we have more plant eaters than meat eaters, but it's not a statistically significant sample.
Gotcha. Dizzy on YouTube was wondering, you mentioned one of the other groups of dinosaurs you work with is Ceratopsians, so things like the horned dinosaur behind me. Do we find any evidence of Ceratopsians in Antarctica?
No, we don't. So Ceratopsians are sort of a fun group that seem to be at least reliable finds that we all agree on are Ceratopsians in the sort of paleo community. Seem to be largely restricted to North America and to Asia. There is a now lost specimen, a lower jaw from South America that was referred to Ceratopsia, called Notoceratops. Because it can't be found, there's some question. There's an inability to actually study it and check on that. So that would be, if it were confirmed, would be the closest record geographically to Antarctica. Interestingly, hadrosaurs, another group very well represented in the fossil record of North America and Asia, do actually show up in Antarctica. So the same rocks in the on the peninsula that yielded the Titanosaur vertebra have also yielded a single tooth of a duck-billed dinosaur. Thankfully, they're diagnostic enough that nobody disputes that is in fact what it is.
Gotcha. Well, along similar lines, Colin and Dusty were both wondering, besides Cryolophosaurus, what other meat-eating dinosaurs are known from Antarctica?
Yeah, so we don't have any other species from the early Jurassic. The reason we actually did all that work on the teeth that came out of the Cryolophosaurus quarry was we were wondering if there was some more diversity. But at least and it's dinosaur teeth, as you well know, Randy, aren't the most diagnostic teeth. They're not like mammal teeth where you can tell them apart very easily. But using the means available to us, we kind of took a deep dive on them, and there doesn't seem to be any difference. So we don't have any evidence there. But if you move up to the late Cretaceous out on the peninsula, there is evidence of a couple of different types of carnivorous dinosaurs. One of these is possibly a Paravian, and sort of a large-ish dromaeosaur-like animal that was named just last year based on the remains of a foot. I actually think the third metatarsal on it is very similar and quite distinct to a large dinosaur, a large predator called Austroraptor from Argentina. Whether or not others agree, but it's over in that part of the tree, so things that are close to birds.
Very cool.
And there is also a tibia of a sort of an earlier diverging, a more sort of large-bodied carnosaurian-looking thing from slightly older sediments on the peninsula. So there's a couple of different lines of evidence for theropods there. And then, of course, you have birds, which are phylogenetically theropods, and those are probably the most abundant and best preserved dinosaurs in the late Cretaceous. So we have Vagavis, which is a very primitive form of duck or waterfowl, but also a number of other bird remains from that part.
Awesome. Well, we have so many questions that unfortunately we won't be able to get to. I think this is a good place to wrap it up with sort of one final question, since we've been talking about what has and has not been discovered. When you get the chance to go back, is there any particular one thing you'd love to find in the next expedition?
Yeah, I mean, I would personally would love to get back to the early Jurassic, and the one thing that would be fun to find would be some kind of ornithischian. So something from the bird-hit dinosaur line, which we have not yet found in the early Jurassic there. They are known from correspondingly aged rocks in South Africa. So there would be reason to haven't been lucky yet.
Very cool. Well, I hope you find it next time you guys go. At this point, just want to say a huge thanks to Dr. Peter Makavicky for joining us this evening, and encourage you to check out his keynote video when it's posted very soon. And a big thanks to all of our viewers for tuning into both this live conversation and all of our other live Polar DinoFest conversations this weekend. This weekend's live panels are helping us to kick off 10 weeks of Polar DinoFest exploration, with a new polar dinosaur video being released by one of our 12 paleontologists every Friday at 10 a.m. Mountain Time between now and April 2nd. Peter's full live video will be the first to be published this coming Friday at January 29th at 10 a.m. Mountain Time. And you'll be able to find that video and all our other paleontologist presentations and recorded live streams on our website at nhmu.utah.edu/DinoFest. And if you missed it, that website also includes recordings of all of those live conversations from this weekend. Finally, don't forget that our inspiration for this year's theme is our current special exhibit, Antarctic Dinosaurs, which is open at the Natural History Museum of Utah through April 4th. Be sure to supplement your online Polar DinoFest experience with an in-person visit to the exhibit by booking your tickets online in advance on our website. Polar DinoFest has been made possible by the Alternative Visions Fund, the Utah Legislature, and the Utah Division of Arts and Museums. Many thanks to these sponsors for helping us bring Polar DinoFest online. Thank you so much for tuning in. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel to get the latest videos from all of our scientists here at the museum. Give us your feedback in the chat. And we hope you to keep exploring Polar DinoFest online in the coming weeks through all of our social media channels and our website. The more you dig, the more you'll uncover about the hidden world of polar dinosaurs. Thank you so much, Pete, for joining us. I hope you have a great evening.
Thank you. Same to everyone who's listening and watching.
Every year, NHMU's DinoFest brings you face-to-face with the world's top paleontologists and their incredible discoveries. Now in its 5th year, DinoFest is going online with 10 weeks of virtual exploration of the frozen world of polar dinosaurs. From the Alaskan North Slope to Antarctica, dinosaurs are found on all 7 continents. But how did they survive at the extreme ends of the Earth? Join us online each week starting January 23rd as we introduce a different paleontologist whose research has helped uncover a thriving polar world far different than what we know today. Polar DinoFest starts online January 23rd and continues through the run of our special exhibit, Antarctic Dinosaurs, open through April 4th. Don't miss it.